This week, we welcome Saša Zdjelar, SVP of Security Assurance at Salesforce, to discuss why Zero Trust is not a SKU. In the leadership and communications section, the number one growth killer is leadership debt. How to talk to your board and C-suite about cybersecurity, 5 ways to unite security and compliance, and more. Business Security Weekly starts now.
This is Security Weekly, for security professionals, by security professionals. Broadcasting live from G-Unit Studios in Rhode Island, it's the show where we explore the business of security to improve the security of business. Your trusted source for actionable insights on leadership, communication, and innovation. Get ready for Business Security Weekly.
The shift to remote and hybrid work over the past 2 years has accelerated application development on cloud infrastructure. However, securing these new assets has lagged behind. Qualys CloudView, the next generation cloud security posture management, delivers an end-to-end multi-cloud security and compliance solution encompassing the entire application lifecycle from build to runtime. CloudView enables enterprises to assess their cloud security and compliance posture, identify risks and gaps, auto-remediate issues, proactively enforce best practices, improve compliance and audits rapidly and efficiently. Identify your most vulnerable cloud assets by visiting securityweekly.com/Qualys. Is your organization finding it difficult to achieve compliance and scale its security posture? As G2's highest rated cloud compliance software, Drata streamlines your SOC 2, ISO 27001, PCI DSS, HIPAA, GDPR, and many more security frameworks, and provides continuous 24-hour control monitoring so you can focus on scaling securely. Drata is also the only compliance automation platform with a private tenant database. That's like having your cake and securing it too. Listeners of Business Security Weekly get 10% off Drata by visiting securityweekly.com/Drata. That's DRATA. Welcome to Business Security Weekly. This is episode number 272, recorded August 8th, 2022. I am your host, Matt Alderman, here in Texas. Joining remotely are my co-hosts this week. First, Mr. Tyler Robinson. Hey, Tyler.
How you doing, Matt? Good to see you, buddy.
How warm is it in Idaho?
I don't know, man. I literally just came out of the mountains. I was off grid for probably 6 days, so I'm just acclimating to this valley weather now.
Nice.
It's probably 80s.
Also joining me from this great state of Idaho is Mr. Lee Neely. Hey, Lee.
Hey, how you doing? It's good to be here. On the southwest side of the state, it's only 80 degrees right now, and we got a break. It's only going to be about 90 today. We've had some triple digits the last couple of weeks, and bless Tyler's heart, he's been avoiding it up in the mountains.
Yeah, I looked at the weather forecast, and I'm like, wait, it's going to drop below 100 like next Tuesday. Like, holy cow, I haven't seen numbers like that in a long time.
Yeah, you guys are you got the heat turned on.
Oh, yeah. Do you have a specific guest or topic that you want us to cover on one of the shows? Submit your suggestions for guests by visiting securityweekly.com/guests and completing the form. We review those suggestions often, and we'll reach out to you once reviewed. Saša is the Senior Vice President of Security Assurance at Salesforce, where he leads a global organization and is the executive sponsor for strategic corporate security initiatives such as Zero Trust. Prior to Salesforce, Saša spent nearly 2 decades working in the energy sector in various security and non-security roles, working on strategy, enterprise security and architecture, software engineering, ERP systems designs and integration, program and product management, planning, and stewardship. He is a member of the Ford's Technology Council, a fellow at the Cyber Readiness Institute, a member of the Black Hat CISO Summit Advisory Board and Black Hat Content Review Board, and an active member in various organizations such as InfraGard, ISACA, and ISSA. Saša, welcome to Business Security Weekly.
Thank you so much, Matt, Tyler, and Lee. It's a pleasure to be here. I can't wait to get into the topic.
Yeah, me too. We have a similar background a little bit. I came out of nuclear power. You came out of the energy side. We were talking about this on the prep call the other day, and I want to bring you back at some point to talk about homegrown CISOs. But we're going to talk Zero Trust today. And this is a topic we've covered pretty often on this show this year with the executive order around implementation of zero trust at the federal agency levels. Lee's going to have some very interesting insights on the work that has to happen there. But one of the challenges, as we know, is zero trust is 5 core domains. It's not a single product. It has to cover things like identity and devices and network and data and applications. And so what's interesting about this topic is your title is Zero Trust is not a SKU. And my first response is, yeah, duh.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Except I think the challenge is not everyone knows that, right? If you go to the trade shows, certainly if you look at the architecture, that might be coming out of a number of vendors, I think everyone's trying to sell you something zero trust related. And many are making claims that, by buying their product or tool or solution, you're effectively buying zero trust. And I think just a little bit of disambiguation is probably needed for, the, non-core professionals and experts in the space to realize what zero trust is and maybe more importantly what it isn't. And I think the tagline of "it's not a SKU" helps get the message across that you can't go buy zero trust.
It's not 5 SKUs either, right? Because again, it's more than just about product. Right? I think is the big kind of part of this discussion, right? Is you can't just solve zero trust by buying a bunch of products, trying to integrate them together. So let's start thinking about, where do you start with zero trust? Like, before you even think about technology, what's the first thing, if you want to implement a zero trust environment, zero trust architecture, like, where do you actually start?
Yeah, that's a great question. I actually wish it was 5 SKUs. I wish I could just go buy 5 things and now I have zero trust. My argument, I won't claim that I'm right, but I will claim that it's in the right direction. That it probably all starts with source data. And I know that might not be the most popular comment because it sounds sort of non-exotic. It's not a red or purple team, and it's not some sort of ninja tool, but it starts with how good your source data is. So, for example, how can you secure something that you don't know that you have? So, how good is your asset inventory? How good is your privilege management? How good is your asset management? How good are some of those core IT things that I would say, I've kind of been arguing for a while, as have others, that your best ROI in security comes from sort of very non-exotic things. It comes from just being really good at the basics, at the fundamentals, and at hygiene. And what I'm hoping to get the message across in this interview and others is that don't go down the path of buying and deploying tools until you've assured that the things that will give your zero trust program a higher chance of success are in place already, like asset management.
I was going to say, isn't there even a lower level question of what do we hope to gain by going down the zero trust path? Define what the endpoint and the reward is.
Totally agree. I think a number of folks see it as a way to implement MFA, right? Or replace VPN. And, those are all, I think we would all argue on this show, the wrong answer. But the right answer is a little bit more nuanced and complicated, right? I think you're absolutely right. We should start with the end in mind to say, what is the desired outcome? Is it we want to reduce blast radius? We want to make mergers and acquisitions, less risky by not having to open up our whole environment, but pieces of it at a time. We want to make remote work better enabled while still secure. Sort of what is the end goal, and then work your way backwards. I think you're dead on, Lee.
I was going to ask, are there situations in which the zero trust domains can be implemented if you have not started down some of those fundamentals or basic paths? And are there great use cases? Like you were saying, you guys have a ton of mergers and acquisitions. Are there good use cases where you can implement those as a risk reduction or mitigation in order to substantiate a better starting point as you start to get those mergers and acquisitions?
Yeah, I think it's a great point. I think just back to what Lee was saying, as long as you've defined that end goal for yourself or the use case, and you're going into a clear-headed knowing what you're expecting to get out of it. So to your point, right, if you'd like to make mergers and acquisitions better and more secure, and that's the end result, then replacing your traditional VPN with some sort of a software-defined perimeter product to allow micro-tunneling or more precise access to resources, if that's the goal and that's what you accomplish, great. But you can't go into it thinking that you will have micro tunneling and principle of least privilege to every last endpoint on the most, reduced set of ports and services. You won't get that unless you have good source data to start with. But I think you're absolutely right. There are use cases that can be enabled just by doing that. One of them could just be performance, right? You don't have to go for a secure web gateway because it's better or more secure than traditional on-prem proxies, but it might give you the ability to, for example, have better routing to your destinations. It's also more secure because the security stack could involve things like SSL inspection that maybe you didn't have in your on-prem system. So there could be use cases and gains that aren't, all of it, but that are substantial enough, and they don't necessarily have to be security. I'll say one other maybe non-conventional thing, that I think zero trust is one of the few initiatives in security in the maybe 15, 20 years that I've been involved that I can see that has the potential to do all three things at once. It can reduce costs, improve security, and enhance productivity. Normally, you get one or maybe two of three, and you feel happy about it. But I feel with zero trust, there's the potential for all three.
But if we do it the right way, which I think is the point, right? We covered an article 2 or 3 weeks ago from Gartner that says, by 2025, 60% of organizations will attempt to implement zero trust and half of them will fail, right? So although it has the potential, there's also a lot of risk and unknown in implementing these zero trust architectures. And what I find so fascinating, because we've talked about this for years, it starts with just basic asset management. CIS has hardware and software inventories as at the top of the list as part of their critical controls. But yet it's not very sexy. It's coming back. There's a lot of cybersecurity asset management plays out there now, and a lot of investment going into core asset management. But for a long time, nobody was really interested in having really good asset inventories. But if that is the foundation, does that renew, hopefully, for organizations, why assets are so important? Because that data is so foundational to then drive to the rest of your zero trust architecture, right?
Yeah, I think this story in some ways is almost a repeat of the cloud story, right? When the cloud story first started, the potential, right, the built up potential and promise was huge, but it always came with that appended if done right. And how many cases do we know where people have gone cloud and it has actually turned out disastrous because their bill was 3 times, they weren't aware of what it looks like when you have a water meter for a service, for infrastructure as service hosting or things like that. So it's no different than cloud. It's also when done right. I think that's an important disclaimer in zero trust as well.
Are there massive challenges in order to we've kind of adopted this hybrid cloud, the SaaS application model where everybody is integrating everything? Does that change how the zero trust domains and or implementation happens? And is there additional risks from things like SaaS applications and what those integrations end up having to entail for your cost or maintaining and management of those?
Yeah, I think it's a trade-off. I think this is another one of those things that is not talked about enough. For example, I think we would all argue that by and large, single sign-on is a great thing, right? Having token-based assertions and once you sign in once, having then a seamless experience is a great thing, and it is. But it also means that that one thing now becomes that much more important to secure versus having separate logins for different things. So I think the SaaS paradigm and federation between providers, tight integration between providers, web hooks flying everywhere, embedded iframes between products and origin domains. I mean, all of those things make the experience so seamless, but at the same time introduce a tremendous amount of potential risk. Once again, like Matt said, if not done well.
Right. Yeah. When I think about what kind of my thesis has always been application, user, data security first, which are 3 of the 5 domains, right? What's missing out of there is the network and the endpoint. And depending on whether you're full SaaS or a combination of hybrid cloud and other things, you may not own the network and the endpoint. So I've got asset inventory, right? So I've got my software ties into the application side. I got my hardware ties into the endpoint. Identity has to play in here. You talked about single sign-on, but even just some of the fundamentals around identity. The other big thing I've seen, having gone to Identiverse, which was a conference that Cyber Risk Alliance now owns from Ping Identity, is there's a lot of different identity players trying to solve identity from lots of different components. That has to come together, I think, to have a better identity component to zero trust. Like, there's a lot of things in the identity space besides single sign-on and MFA and privilege access management, just 3 of many, that still have to come together to really solve that pillar of zero trust. So where do you start from an identity standpoint?
Yeah, and I've seen this both done, like on our theme, well and not well, right? I've seen where things are anchored in, a monolithic on-prem identity store that is then feeding, cloud accounts and federation accounts, and I've seen that work very well because it maintains, a tight degree of control over identities and what they're allowed to do. But I've also seen the opposite. I've seen where cloud-only identities are allowed. There's sprawl. You don't have good tie. You don't have a tie between an account and a persona, which will drive kind of HR nuts in many cases, because then there's not an authoritative, enterprise directory that drives it all. So yeah, I mean, I think at the core of zero trust, as you're mentioning, is certainly how good is the identity asserted. I'll also go a step further and say something I don't think the industry talks enough about is once you log in, from that point on, your identity is passed for you, regardless of the technology, with SAML, OAuth, doesn't matter, is passed on. And from that point on, every system is designed to trust that initial assertion. But I haven't seen technologies that validate or scrutinize the strength of the assertion. In other words, if I logged in with a username and password, that should be a different strength of assertion than for someone who logged in with 2 out of band factors or 3 and biometric and all these other facets. But once you generate that SAML or whatever the claim is, it doesn't care about the strength of the assertion from any systems that it then passes that identity to.
Well, I've actually seen that. It is actually, there's actually an attribute in Active Directory that can tell whether you've logged in with a smart card or a password. That is an easy, low-hanging fruit to capture, and you can feed it to your IDP.
Yeah, for Kerberos and some auth protocols that works,
right, but not everything.
But some of the more web-centric ones, it's a different paradigm.
Right,
yeah.
and I've also run into applications where you get different access if you're in username and password versus logging in with MFA, like a smart card. So that's there. I'm not saying it's mature. I don't catch me wrong. I think it's an immature space, and I actually think we are going to have to learn a lot about it. I sit in the government space, and they're very much focusing on, AAL3 type authentication versus 2. And although if I'm reading the tea leaves right, even though they've got all these procedures for determining the authentication strength, I think what they want to see across the board is the highest level, even if it's not required. So, but anyway, I don't mean to steal your thunder. Your point is absolutely fabulous, that we need to be able to differentiate authentication strength versus the data and or other objects that are available. Trying to stay generic there, because I think that would help us, but I don't think we're used to thinking that way. I mean,
I think that's the point, is that is not one of the things that's talked about in the mainstream sort of zero trust discussion. The other one that, I was having a chat with Tyler about this as well, a couple of months ago, is once you do all of the, identity assertion, once you do all of the device attestation, is it in a state that you desire? Is it patched? Is it whatever? Is it known good? Is it tied to a tenant, for your MDM that is yours? A lot of zero trust implementations after that just turn on VPN, right? They just enable full extension of the network, rather than that being the end of the beginning, right? That's just the end of the beginning of what you should have access to. After that, is this person in an entitlement group that should allow access to this resource? And then is that resource scoped tightly enough to a VIP, an IP, a set of host names, and on what ports and services? And that's, where I think the discussion around source data becomes challenging, because that is not source data that usually lives in some sort of CMDB or a comparable system. App modeling and things like that are still predominantly done sort of by humans. You profile the app, you describe it. It's not really, I don't know of any organization that would say that data is authoritative enough and trusted enough where you would, run the risk of your app not working if it was inaccurate. So, at that point, you have to instrument getting that telemetry from something that's already running, right? EPP or EDR tools that know that, this binary, acme.exe always reaches out to this VIP or these IPs on these ports and services, and have that somewhere, that mapping, that constant mapping of entitlements. That, to me, that is the hard part of zero trust. Deploying agents, that create tunnels. That's not the hard part. The hard part is this underlying stuff that drives access.
But
Yeah,
that's
because
that's the stuff we're not actually getting to yet, right? Because everybody tends to make that stop at, hey, we've got zero trust, we've made that connection. Like you said, these single sign-on, SAML, all the things that attackers like to blend in with and ride on the back of, like after those connections are made, you're pretty much given that VPN connection and that free reign because there's not a lot of visibility. So is that providing us a false sense of security and maybe even a visibility gap because of where we think that zero trust is getting us to? I think you're spot on that after the connection, that's where the bad stuff happens. That's where the attackers love to live, and that's where you're gonna see stuff. So that false sense of security, is that a big issue with a lot of the vendors that are out there?
Well, I think it back to Lee's comment around defining what the end goal looks like. And this is why I think we're having probably the millionth podcast on the topic of zero trust, is it's just sort of not settled debate yet, right? We don't have a common definition of what the definition of done looks like for zero trust. Is it I've implemented MFA? Is it I've done MFA and I do a little bit of device attestation? Like what is the totality of it? And my argument would be most definitions, even the original ones, from Forrester and others, don't go far enough in defining this last piece, which is, granting the most granular types of access to explicit ports and services, and then re-evaluating that auth N and auth Z on a continuous basis.
Yeah, because I think that's where the network component comes into play, right? And once I attest that you are who you are and know your assertion levels, it's how do I create paths for you in the network that it's the only stuff you can get to. You were describing this in the prep call, like, yeah, once you're in, you have access to everything. Well, that's not a zero trust networking principle at all, right? And I would have thought that some of the zero trust network access vendors would have solved some aspects of this, but it sounds like it's still manual and it's not real time. So there's still challenges there with some of these zero trust network access concepts.
Yeah, I mean, in my opinion, gets into a little bit of nuance between different solution providers in this space. Some are a little bit more capable in this space than others, based on my knowledge of the vendor landscape. Some have already thought ahead for the type of analysis you'd want to do of that type of signaling traffic itself, right? I mean, that becomes the new telemetry to really look at, is the signaling traffic for your software-defined perimeter products and what they're granting. And for many corporations, it's providing, in some cases, the very first insights you have into your internal system utilization, right? A lot of traditional systems were generally perimeter oriented and looking at what happens on the north-south boundary. But east-west, what was consumed internally, it was usually not, logged, and there weren't a lot of analytics and insights into it. I mean, you would have to have been, extremely hungry for logs and had an endless budget to consume, switch log traffic, which most companies weren't. These types of technology for software-defined perimeter provide you some unbelievable telemetry, in some cases for the first time ever, into consumption patterns, right? What do baselines actually look like? And there are vendors that know how valuable this is and have built-in mechanisms for that to be easily consumed into, insider threat intel and SIMs and other things. Others have not thought of that angle and have actually made it unbelievably hard to get to that traffic, right? Because it's TLS 1.3 and they have no way to, provide inspection. They have no way to shim off into another system. So to me, this is a little bit of a nuance between different solution providers in this space.
Yeah. The other thing you mentioned is about behavior and understanding software behavior and binary behavior, right? You said EPP and the EDR. I think it extends beyond that, right? When you think about application communication and what's communicating with what, we did a segment on here a few months back talking about the SBOM and the evolution of the SBOM beyond just the software bill of materials, but to understand the behavior of those components that are in there. And again, that's another piece of telemetry when you think about application to user to network communications, because if you had behavior baselines, you could then start to look for anomalous or malicious potential behavior, which would then flag somebody that says, wait a minute, did something get compromised in my network? And we're not far enough along that path yet, which would be a zero trust component, I would think.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're scratching on like a couple of other topics and something that is just completely not talked about in our industry, but should be. If you rewind back to kind of the early days of allow listing, right? It became a problem to manage. So you had companies. I think NSA put out its own, and maybe CIS or a number of these, internet kind of standards bodies put out lists of known good, which would tell you this binary is good, so you can add this to your XML file. Of course, that would completely destroy your endpoint performance because those XML files only ever grew, they didn't shrink. And I think a lot of that pattern is happening now with trying to understand the behaviors of binaries. So to your point, acme.exe, what ports and services did that connect out on TCP or UDP? Does it ever do inbound or only outbound? Like knowing those known good patterns, I think is going to become increasingly important for binaries. And it's almost like we need a cyber UL or something for binaries to tell us the known good patterns so that the EPPDR and other security tools that can look at these patterns and evaluate them, the behavior can say, yes, this is consistent, or actually statistically speaking, this one binary is actually behaving anomalously compared to the baseline we've been given for it.
That's a great use case, and this is actually where I am excited to see some of the really good ML hierarchy charts that looks at those statistically anomalous behaviors, because from an attacker side, that is very difficult to hide. I can't detect when something is detecting a behavior. I can detect when there's a honey token. I can detect if there's things there that are probably not right, but I can't detect when I'm acting in a way that I shouldn't be because I don't have a baseline. And when you start to add in some AI and ML to those, that has really good outlined, statistically diagrammed charts of behavior, that becomes very difficult to actually circumvent. A lot of the traditional circumventions that we've seen as an attacker, that becomes null and void. You just have to utilize it, and if you're trying to get C2 out, you have to communicate. So there's no way around what you're doing, and that's a good way to get detection and get caught. That telemetry is going to be increasingly important as we move forward.
Yeah, the other space that I would mention in this, kind of along the theme of what are the areas not being talked about enough, I think we just nailed a few of them. I think another one is, we talk a lot about, binary trust and is this pattern of behavior good or not? But all of that is assuming that we don't have an underlying rootkit, already living at,
Firmware?
ring zero or kernel level, right? So to me, another space that zero trust, and I guess it would fit sort of most neatly into the device domain, but the device trust should also have a much stronger focus on is this device compromised or not. And most people assume that device has one firmware, one UEFI or something. Most typical laptop models have over 45 components, each of which have their own firmware, their own patching that's required, and most of that is completely overlooked. If you look back the last few years, the Spectre and Meltdown and other examples where firmware has been the difference between a secure or an insecure system. I think that's another area that in the zero trust discussion just doesn't get enough attention, is how important firmware security is.
Yeah, without that firmware integrity, there is literally nothing that can be trusted at that level. You have the ability to manipulate the system and traffic, which is, if only there were a good company or two that was doing more firmware security analysis and validation, that would be great.
There's a couple good ones out there, but it brings up a very valid point. We have the debate about whether the agents at the OS user level or at the kernel level, it doesn't really matter if the firmware has been compromised, right? Because it's going to compromise the entire device. So, I would like to see people focus a little further down the stack, because we have seen, firmware attacks that have, definitely compromised the endpoint, regardless of what other agents, EDR, EPP was running on it. So it is another valid area of concern that, yeah, you're right. It would fall in the device domain, but it's not talked about enough. People think the EPPs and the EDRs are enough.
I had another question. I'm wondering if people are thinking about the mindset of being aware of exactly what connections are permitted from the endpoint. I mean, today, right, you got a remote worker, they want to get something that's not allowed through the perimeter, they just turn off the VPN and they go for it. And actually, in many places, the idea of limiting outbound connections through your perimeter, which is something we've done for 25 plus years, is foreign. And I'm thinking, have we got a culture change in front of us?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the answer is almost inevitably yes. I can't see how we don't. At least that's my take.
Especially with work at home and all of the integrations to cloud platforms. It may not even be that SaaS application's cloud platform. I mean, there's everything has to communicate with Azure, with AWS, with all of the places that the SaaS applications live and are hosted. And so your ability to do a lot of that traditional outbound filtering and the deny all as a default has kind of went out of the wayside, especially with the work from home aspect. And now we're at a different conundrum where we're trying to decide, is the work from home back to the office and then out to all the cloud applications, is that even something that is feasible to log and monitor with the level of detail that and amount of data that is coming out of those things? So we really have to be very, very diligent and very intentional for the things that we are logging and looking at. Otherwise, we end up with the log fatigue. We end up with too much data that nothing happens, or we end up with a time delta in which that data is irrelevant because the attackers moved on.
Yeah, actually, this is a little bit to the point that I made at the beginning, that zero trust can be an initiative that saves money. I mean, this is an example where I know many companies that they sort of have enjoyed the fact that they haven't had a network during COVID. And whether people are going back or not to the office is almost irrelevant. They don't want a network, right? It is from a security perspective and from a cost perspective. If you can get to a functional, performant, secure method of not needing a network, it is far better not to have one in every way. So I know a lot of companies that are using this opportunity to be able to switch, for example, from expensive global MPLS circuits to public internet circuits, or from running their own network at their company and carrying the capital and depreciation of expensive switching and networking gear and access points, to just purchasing managed internet, right? Just public internet, sort of the coffee shop concept. So I think there are genuine cost reduction prizes that can come with zero trust being fully implemented.
But does that risk shift from the corporation to the different providers in which you're now trusting? Does that actually take the risk away from the organization, or is that more of a liability shift rather than a risk and threat mitigation?
Yeah, I think the answer back, unfortunately, to Matt's original point of if done well, right? If done well, it can be very managed risk. For example, if all of your traffic is riding down fully encrypted tunnels and you have always on, tunneling to trusted resources, I less of a concern than if you don't have those things. Visibility, right? If you before had some visibility through on-prem proxies, and now you have a public network and you don't know where it's going, but you haven't yet implemented some sort of a secure web gateway solution that's always on, again, you could be losing visibility. That's not a great thing. DLP loss, loss of intellectual property. We also have the great resignation still very much happening. And, more and more there's a risk of people kind of walking out the door with the types of materials that might be prized by another employer. Your ability to detect that and prevent it is also very different, whether you have a public network, coffee shop network, or your own network.
Mhm.
So there certainly are risks and trade-offs.
Yeah. I mean, I predicted we'd see this day where I might not own the network, I might not own the endpoint. I still own the app user data stack, right? And those are the 5 components of zero trust architecture. So, what I'm interested in is, do you really focus on the network and the endpoint? Maybe you do, maybe you don't. It depends on your environment. But app user and data, you're going to have to get your arms around, because I don't see that ever coming out of the purview of the security team anytime soon, because those are the core components you control as an organization. And maybe the network and the endpoint aren't enough, but it goes back to Lee's point at the beginning, which is what's your end state? Like, what are your goals for zero trust? And then what are the right components to bring to the table to actually get there?
Yeah, and actually, just to add to the point Tyler was just making, I've spent probably my career relatively evenly split between security and core IT. And let's say you take that same kind of public cloud or public internet approach at your office, but it's a call center. Now that's a mission critical thing where you no longer own your own failover, your own QoS for audio, traffic priority, things that may actually ruin your brand and your business if you're not careful about it. I mean, I've seen multiple instances of that.
Yeah. Saša, fabulous conversation. We could go on forever, but thank you so much for joining us on Business Security Weekly.
Thank you, Matt, Tyler, and Lee. It was a pleasure. It was all mine, and I look forward to another opportunity to engage with all of you.
Same here.
Yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely.
We're going to take a quick break and then cover the leadership and communications articles for this week.